Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the June program of the Naperville Astronomical Association. Normally, I don't feel like I have to preface that anymore, but since we're on the web, I guess I should mention that we're a suburban Chicagoland group that's in Illinois in the United States, for those of us who may be viewing us from elsewhere on the planet. I'm going to, besides saying thank you for joining, run through just a few quick reminders and announcements. As I try to do before we start each presentation that we're streaming online, I'd like to remind you, if you don't know, how to maximize your view when you're watching us either on the club website or on Facebook. If you go theoretically down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen with your mouse or your finger, you should get the little maximize view buttons that allow you to go full screen with the presentation. If you have any questions during the program tonight, we have two ways, as always, of asking them. If you're viewing us on Facebook, you can just post your questions in the comments section. Our engineer, Jim, is watching that feed as it goes along, and he will be gathering together those questions to be presented to our speaker tonight. Probably towards the end of the program, he'll actually be answering things. So your response might not pop up immediately, but they will get passed along. If you're not on Facebook and you want to email your questions in, you can send them into this address, questions@naperastro.org, via email. And Jim is also following that inbox to see what comes in there. We also continue to welcome your suggestions for what we might do for future programming or to improve our program. And we're expecting to be doing this for some time, and we'd like to be as worthwhile as we can be for your audience pleasure. Brief review of upcoming events. There's not a lot on our calendar. In 2 weeks, we have our Astronomy Fundamentals program, and for June, that's Tuesday the 17th at 7:30 p.m., we will do what we've been doing for the past few years in June and July, and doing family-oriented programs, in other words, kid-oriented programs. So we're going to have a presentation that's actually a number of segments with short, interesting stuff for kids to enjoy. If you follow our calendar, that'll keep up with other future programming that we've got planned, but we're also still doing pop-up events, mainly observing-oriented things. You might have been to our moon observing session this past weekend, and it's the sort of thing we're going to continue doing also. So we'll post those on Facebook and also on the message board for members. So if you're a member of the club, you'll get notifications of those things. We may only notify you about them a few hours in advance because that's how we're planning them out. This evening, we have a guest speaker coming in, and he is Joseph DalSanto. He's an associate professor of earth science and astronomy at the College DuPage, and you may well have heard him speak at NAA presentations before. You may have seen his presentations online or in person via the college also about astronomy and space-oriented topics. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about the Apollo lunar missions. We're just passing our 50th anniversary period of those amazing exploits. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the airwaves over to Joe and see if we can get going here. So there's Joe. And I'm going to
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Drew, for that introduction. It's nice to be back with you again tonight to talk about mankind's greatest adventure, the Apollo missions reaching the moon. As Drew said, last year we celebrated 50 years since that great event. And tonight I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. Now, I realize that many of you have some knowledge and understanding of this topic, but many perhaps don't. And so I do want to start out by taking a few minutes to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of context with which to understand this. And this will enable for you to really appreciate the magnitude of this achievement. So let me take you back to the 1950s. Probably most of us weren't alive then, but you may know that this was the era of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had nuclear weapons, and yet at that time, those were delivered via aircraft. Both knew that if they could develop rocket technology, they would have a tremendous strategic advantage against the other. And so it was that they wanted to develop such technology, and yet they knew they had to do it peacefully or risk nuclear war. So by the middle 1950s, both nations were hard at work at developing this. And basically by, whoops, I went to the wrong screen there. Sorry about that. Excuse me 1 second here. Let me scroll back up. I apologize for the technical glitch here. A quick preview. Somehow I ended up on my last slide. So bear with me just 1 second here. As you can see, get to see there. Sorry about that. All right, let's pick back up. October 1957, the Soviet Union does launch the first satellite into space, Sputnik 1. This is quite a surprise to the United States. They did not realize that the Soviet Union was far enough along to accomplish this, and it was somewhat of a shock and a great concern, frankly, because this basically suggested that they would have the technology to use rockets to deliver nuclear weapons. Well, even though the United States did orbit our own satellite just a few months later in January of 1958, we were behind. And so it was that later that year, in October of 1958, the president at that time suggested and Congress created NASA. This was a move to create a civilian space agency that would lead our exploration of space. And so NASA got to work developing rocket technology. Both nations knew that the next big step after orbiting satellites would be to place a man into space. And both began work on that. The United States more openly, the Soviet Union more secretly. Well, in April of 1961, the Soviet Union shocked the United States again by doing exactly that, by sending the first man into space. Now, the United States was almost ready. They had been hard at work as well. And just a few weeks later, in May of 1961, we launched our first astronaut into space, although he did not orbit the Earth at that time. So now you have a little bit of the background, again, a little context with which to appreciate where this began to take us in terms of Apollo going to the moon. After the United States' first short flight, which I'll discuss in just a moment, then President Kennedy took a very bold step. He met with his advisors and realizing that the United States was behind the Soviet Union in technology, asked, what could we do to not only catch up to them, but surpass them? And the answer was, it's going to take time. They have a lead on us, and we're going to need time to develop our own technology. And really, the first major goal, the next major goal, would be to, again, place humans on the moon. And so it was that Kennedy gave a famous speech in which he challenged the United States. He said that I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Now understand, this was when the United States had exactly 15 minutes of spaceflight experience. And here was Kennedy challenging us to go all the way to the moon. So quite an enormous undertaking would ensue. Well, the national will got behind that, Congress got behind that, and NASA set to work. There would be a number of steps required, though, before we could hope to go to the moon. Let's start out then by looking at the first step, and that was Project Mercury. Project Mercury was born in the late 1950s. NASA set about selecting astronauts from the nation's test pilots. They set about developing the first space capsule, as you see here, the Mercury capsule, in which to send one of these astronauts into Earth orbit for up to 24 hours. There was much to be done. Besides developing the capsule and selecting and training the astronauts, I want to emphasize there was so much that essentially had to be invented. It had never been done before. And those things included such things as the launch facilities, the guidance of the rocket, tracking of the spacecraft, the communications, the recovery. All of these things had not even been invented yet. And so it was quite a challenge for NASA to begin to do that and get this ready for human space flight. Well, from 1961 to 1963, there were 6 Mercury flights flown. Let me just describe those briefly. The first 2 flights in the summer of 1961 were very short 15-minute flights using the Redstone rocket, which you see on the left here. This was a converted ICBM, and it did not really have the power to accelerate the capsule into orbit. And so it was used to loft it to an altitude of about 115 miles to test out the capsule, to test out our launch facilities, our communications, our tracking, our recovery, that again had just been invented. But by February of 1962, NASA was ready to send an astronaut in the capsule into orbit. This required the more powerful Atlas booster to reach orbit. And so there were several missions using that booster, which did place the Mercury capsule into orbit. So this was a great first step for the United States to place astronauts into orbit. Well, there was much more to be done before we could hope to go to the moon, and that fell then to Project Gemini, essentially the second major step, the second program. You see here, first of all, a larger spacecraft that would be able to have 2 astronauts aboard. And so you can think of this program as more of a bridge from the early Mercury missions to the much more sophisticated later Apollo flights. You can see the objectives here. Number 1, again, to not only orbit 2 astronauts, but for much longer duration than the 24 hours of Mercury. Why was that? Well, NASA realized that to get to the moon and back, astronauts would be in space for at least 10, if not 14 days. And so we needed to learn how to do that, how to keep them alive, how to keep the spacecraft running. Number 2, by this point in time, NASA had settled on the need for spacecraft to change their orbit. The early Mercury flights had the booster rocket place the capsule into orbit around the Earth, and there it stayed until it was ready to come down. But it would require that 2 spacecraft be able to change orbits and rendezvous or meet up with each other in space in order for us to go to the moon. This is not as easy as it sounds, certainly not at the time, and again, having to learn how to do this, to match not only velocity and position, but trajectories in space. And once the 2 spacecraft did meet together, we would need to dock them together, as we'll see shortly. The final thing that was required was that astronauts would need to learn to leave their spacecraft, to open the hatch, as you see on the right-hand image here, and get out of their spacecraft. Again, ultimately, we would need to do that to go to the moon. So you can see some very challenging goals and objectives of Project Gemini. By this time, NASA had already hired 9 additional astronauts, and more were on the way for later flights. And so the space program was growing and accelerating as we move forward. So from 1965 through 1966, there were 10 Gemini missions, lasting anywhere from 5 hours to a full 14 days in space. Now let me pause and remind you, I'm going to go back 1 second. You see the 2 astronauts sitting side by side in that left-hand image. Can you imagine sitting there, very much like the front 2 seats of your car, for 14 days? I always used to think they had to be on awfully good terms and be awfully friendly with each other. In order to send this larger spacecraft into orbit, a larger booster was required. This was the Air Force Titan II booster, which was modified for manned spaceflight. And again, we had very successful missions here, although I will say there were a few scary moments. One mission, when the booster ignited, did not leave the ground and had to be shut down safely. Other missions had other problems as well. But over the course of these flights, the astronauts did essentially work through these various objectives. Number 1, rendezvousing in space with each other. Number 2, docking with each other. And number 3, as you can see in our center picture here, leaving the spacecraft and walking in space. This is astronaut Ed White, the first American to walk in space. And it was found that this was not as easy as it might seem. It's very difficult for the astronauts to control their motions and accomplish productive tasks while they were floating here in space. So there was much to learn, much to be done in order for us to put together all of these techniques and all these operational things that would be needed, again, for us to go to the moon. So the mid-1960s were a very busy time for NASA. While the Mercury and Gemini missions were being developed, planned, trained, and launched, other parts of NASA were hard at work on the Apollo missions. So let's move on now and talk about Apollo. Here you can see the 2 main spacecraft that were part of Apollo. Number 1 on the left, the command and service modules, and on the right, the lunar module. Let's describe them briefly. The conical shaped command module you see there would house the astronauts. It would need to provide guidance, navigation, and control. Here is where, again, all of the command operations would take place. And this was the only part of the entire mission that would return the astronauts safely home. All the other pieces would be discarded along the way. The cylindrical service module housed, as you can see, a large rocket engine. This would be used to properly place the spacecraft into lunar orbit, and when the time was come, to leave lunar orbit and return the astronauts safely home. But besides propulsion, the service module provided power and life support for the astronauts as well. So it was a vital piece here as well. On the right, we have the lunar module, which would need to be designed, developed, and built separately. You can see 2 main stages here at the top or left side of the vehicle, a kind of a grayish, darkish ascent stage. Here's where the astronauts would stand and look out their windows as they approached the lunar surface. On the right or bottom of the vehicle was the gold-colored descent stage. This would house the main rocket engine that would slow them from lunar orbit to the surface of the moon. Now, this vehicle, again, had to provide not only propulsion, but guidance and life support for 2 astronauts during their visit and stay on the moon. I got the lunar module deliberately turned on its side here, it seems, because I wanted you to be able to visualize how the 2 spacecraft would dock together. And I'll describe that a bit more as we go along. So again, this gives you some idea of the spacecraft that were required, but as I mentioned earlier, there was far more to be done. Of course, this spacecraft, to go all the way to the moon, would require enormous booster rockets. So let me talk about the Saturn booster rockets. I'll start on the left with the relatively smaller Saturn 1B rocket, as you can see here. This rocket would be used when it was necessary to place the command and service modules into Earth orbit for testing purposes. It would not take the astronauts to the moon. In fact, the very first Apollo mission, Apollo 1, in early 1967, was on the launch pad being tested on a Friday evening when disaster struck. The astronauts were bolted inside of the command module when a fire broke out, and they were not able to escape the command module until they were dead. So this was a very sobering tragedy for NASA. These astronauts are still commemorated to this day every year in January because they gave their lives in the testing of the Apollo spacecraft. Well, NASA obviously had to not only determine what went wrong and how to prevent it, but to, again, reassemble itself essentially. Other problems were found, and so it took some time before they were ready to launch the first manned Apollo mission. In 1968, October of 1968, the Saturn 1B did launch the Apollo 7 mission, the command and service module, for the first time to be tested by astronauts in Earth orbit. That mission went very well, and so again, the command and service module, having been redesigned, were then cleared for future missions. Well, during this time, of course, the enormous rocket you see on your right was being developed, the famous Saturn V booster. This would be the gigantic rocket to send us to the moon. Now I want to give you a little somehow understanding of the power of this rocket, one of the most powerful rockets ever launched. Number one, it would need to send both of those spacecraft we just saw to the moon, and would have to accelerate them to 25,000 miles per hour to do so. Now understand the combined weight of those two Apollo spacecraft was approximately 100,000 pounds. So to accelerate that to 25,000 miles an hour, you can imagine, with the Earth's gravity fighting you, would be quite a challenge. So the rocket was designed into 3 stages, as you see here. The first stage had 5 enormous engines. These together developed 7 million pounds of thrust. That's the equivalent of 160 million horsepower, probably roughly equivalent to the horsepower of all the automobiles in the United States at that time. Just an incredibly powerful booster rocket. The first stage's job was to lift the entire rocket, of course, off the pad, accelerate it to approximately 6,000 or 7,000 miles per hour, and reach an altitude of about 40 miles or 200,000 feet. At that point, its fuel would be exhausted. It was no longer necessary to bring it along, and so it would be released and discarded and fall into the ocean. Meanwhile, that second stage would ignite with 5 relatively smaller engines, although still very, very large. These engines would fire for several minutes and accelerate the remaining rocket to a speed of approximately 15,000 miles per hour and an altitude of approximately 100 miles before these engines would exhaust their fuel. And this stage again would fall away and be discarded and fall into the ocean. Now at this point, the third stage would be remaining along with the 2 spacecraft. They were not quite into Earth orbit, and so that third stage with a single engine would fire and place them into Earth orbit before heading to the moon. It's deemed wise to get into Earth orbit and check everything out after the extremely violent launch of this incredible rocket. So you can well imagine it could take many hours to describe, again, all that went into developing, designing, building, testing the Saturn V booster. I will tell you there were several unmanned launches of this booster before the astronauts were allowed to ride it into space. And so after the Apollo 7 successful mission, NASA was prepared to leave Earth orbit for the first time. I want to give you just a quick idea of how far that really would be. Up to this point in time, orbiting Earth, if you were to imagine in your mind a 1-foot diameter Earth globe, we had reached an altitude of approximately 800 miles, and that would be approximately 1 inch on the scale of a 1-foot Earth globe, if you can picture that. But now, to go 240,000 miles to the moon, this would be 30 times as far. And so it was an enormous distance that the astronauts were planning to go. Well, the next step was to begin to test not only the command and service modules, but the lunar module. Now, it turned out here at the end of 1968, in the fall of 1968, that it was not ready. It had been a very difficult spacecraft to build and test, and it simply wasn't ready. So NASA made a very daring decision at this time, as I'll describe in just a moment. Before I do that, I do want to spend just one more minute here talking about some other very important pieces of this entire project. We mentioned earlier the need to launch the rockets, and so an entire space complex had to be built here in Florida. Perhaps some of you have visited the Kennedy Space Center. You see this enormous cubicle building called the Vehicle Assembly Building to the left. And you see from this aerial view on the right, one of the Saturn V rockets on a mobile launch platform. The rocket was held very firmly, of course, while this very carefully and very slowly made its way from the building where it was assembled to the launch pad. Once the rocket, though, left the pad on its flight, control of the mission would switch to the facility you see on your right. This was the Johnson Space Center, better known as Mission Control. or simply Houston to the astronauts. Here is where the mission would be controlled. Here is where there was tremendous expertise among numerous flight controllers, each with a specific portion of the mission to oversee, whether that was propulsion or guidance or tracking or recovery, power, communication. All these things had to be carefully monitored and controlled. And each of these flight controllers then would report to a flight director. You see one of them sitting here on the right in the white shirt. So here, essentially, you could think of this as the brain center of the entire mission. Yes, the astronauts were aboard, but really most of the expertise would be in this room among the numerous flight controllers who would, again, oversee the various aspects of the mission. Let's talk a little bit about how Apollo would get to the moon. If you watch the diagram here, you can see, of course, step one, you lift off as the rocket heads, as I said, into Earth orbit to check everything out. But after a few orbits, at the precise time required, that third stage engine would reignite, step two, and propel, again, both spacecraft out of Earth orbit at 25,000 miles per hour. Once the third stage had exhausted its fuel, of course, it would shut down. Now the command and service module, which were at the top of the rocket, would be released. The astronauts would fly out just a few hundred feet, turn it around, and come back and dock essentially nose to nose with the lunar module, which was stored inside the very top of the remaining rocket. And after extracting the lunar module, then the third stage would be discarded. So this was how both spacecraft, the command service module and the lunar module, as you can see in step three then, would then coast the rest of the way to the moon. Of course, they would be slowly losing velocity due to Earth's gravity until they reached the vicinity of the moon, at which it would begin to accelerate them. Here then, the engine on the service module would fire and break them properly into lunar orbit, where they would again prepare for the landing. Once they were ready for that, two of the astronauts would transfer to the lunar module and begin the very dramatic descent to the surface, as we'll see in just a few minutes. One astronaut would remain above. After the astronauts had completed their mission on the surface, the ascent engine of the lunar module would bring them back to lunar orbit to again rendezvous, as we had discussed earlier, with the command module, so that all three astronauts would be aboard the command module. So here is where all of those earlier missions in the Gemini series paid off. These were the very astronauts that had flown some of those Gemini missions. They were now experienced at rendezvous and docking and changing of orbits, and this served them well during these moon missions. Once all were safely back aboard the command module, the remaining lunar module could be discarded, and the command and service module would fire their engine, head back home there, as you see in step 6. And ultimately, upon approaching Earth, even the service module would be discarded, and the command module would return and re-enter Earth's atmosphere. So quite a complex mission profile. Why all the extra steps? Why not just fly a simple rocket there and back? Well, there were many advantages to this method. I don't have time to go into the details, but essentially it minimized the weight requirements and it maximized the efficiency of the mission to take these extra steps. Again, discarding components as we went along. So now that we've taken a minute to describe that, let's pick up our story where we left off. The fall of 1968, Apollo 8 follow-up mission, originally scheduled to take the lunar module into a high Earth orbit and test it out. However, I said it was not ready. Rather than wait any longer, as I said, NASA took a very bold, very daring move. They decided instead to send Apollo 8 to the moon without the lunar module. Why did they decide to do that? Well, primarily because they knew there was so much to be done for the first time. In other words, this would be the first time that astronauts would ride the Saturn V rocket, not only into Earth orbit, but then to perform the all-important burn and send themselves to the moon. what was called the translunar injection burn to the moon. That burn had to be precise and accurate to send them at the right direction and the right velocity to intercept the moon so that the command and service module could fire their engine and brake gently into orbit. There would be communications, tracking, all those other pieces that needed to be, again, learned. And so they deemed it a wise move, and I think it was, to do this without the lunar module the first time. So let's do this. Let's take a moment and watch the launch of Apollo 8, a very dramatic time here in December of 1968, the first 3 astronauts to ride the Saturn V into space and visit the moon.
14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Couldn't see the instrument panel.
We have cleared the tower.
I thought we'd had it during the launch. I was hoping that Frank Borman didn't have his hand on the abort controller. He said he took his hand off and he'd rather die than make a false abort.
1 minute after liftoff, the Saturn V is already supersonic.
Well, the Saturn V is still the most powerful machine that man has ever devised. 20 tons of fuel a second, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. I think we were all surprised at how strong that thing was. It had had 2 or 3 iffy missions before ours, but it was a piece of cake. It just worked beautifully. Unbelievable.
5 engines in the first stage blast the Saturn V to 7 times the speed of sound.
The second stage cut in. Big bang.
At 40 miles high, it's still accelerating.
When you staged, you were thrown forward in the belts and then backward in the belts.
And I thought I was being catapulted through the instrument panel.
All sources show that the stage is burning perfectly.
The third stage fires twice. First, the boost into orbit. The second burn takes the crew of Apollo 8 where no men have ever been.
So as I mentioned, a very dramatic launch there. The first launch with astronauts aboard the Saturn V. You heard the descriptions of Frank Borman, Bill Anders. This mission included Jim Lovell. And these astronauts were the first brave souls to leave Earth orbit and head to the moon. You might know that, as I mentioned, it was in December of 1968. And some of you might realize that they actually entered into lunar orbit near Christmas time. And they read back a very moving statement in lunar orbit as everyone kind of paused and reflected on the magnitude of what they had done. And there was one other thing that came back from that mission. To my mind, at least, one of the greatest images ever taken, very iconic image here. Earthrise from Apollo 8. One of the astronauts made the statement, he said, you know, we went to the moon, but we discovered the Earth. And what an incredibly dramatic image this is. I never fail to be amazed by this view of our planet floating serenely in space. This really got a lot of people's attention at the time. We began to realize that our Earth was fragile, delicate, and very, very precious to us. And this actually encouraged people to begin thinking about what we were doing to the Earth and what we needed to do to take better care of it and preserve it. So this was one of those unseen side benefits of going to the moon, was literally to see our precious Earth from deep space. Really a profound sight. Well, the astronauts successfully not only orbited the moon 10 times, but fired their engine, headed home, and landed safely for the first successful mission to the moon. As we moved into the spring of 1969, NASA now was finally ready to begin testing the lunar lander. Here, I think they made another wise decision to take a bit more cautious approach. Many thought perhaps we'd go back to the moon and get ready to land now, but no, NASA said, let's test out our lander on the Apollo 9 mission in Earth orbit. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a couple images in Earth orbit of Command Service Module and the first manned flight of the Lunar Module. This was not a trivial mission either. After launch and undocking, the Lunar Module was flown to a great distance, several hundred miles away from the Command Module, changed orbits, fired its engines, tested its systems thoroughly to make sure that it would function properly with 2 astronauts aboard. Obviously, their lives would be at stake. So this was a very successful mission in March of 1969. Still, at that point, many people were excited that perhaps NASA was ready to land on the moon, but they said, let's do it one more time. Let's get even more familiar with that lunar lander. We had only been to the moon once, and we could use a little more practice, again, flying there, orbiting the moon before trying to add the landing. And so they did exactly that on the Apollo 10 mission. They did return to the moon. You can see some images there, again, of the Command Service Module on the bottom and the Lunar Module at the top. Here, the Lunar Module was again tested a second time, this time in lunar orbit. And here again, actually, there were a few scary moments. An incorrect switch setting sent the Lunar Module briefly out of control. And so once again, here is where a highly skilled, highly trained, highly experienced, and very brave test pilots took control of the vehicle and righted their ship and essentially saved their own lives by being so well prepared and so well trained. So all of the hard work, all of that training that the astronauts went through really paid off in situations like this, far, far from home. Well, during these missions, of course, the succeeding mission, Apollo 11, was being prepared. Those astronauts, that crew was training. And it turned out that this would indeed be the first mission to attempt to land on the moon. So let's talk a little bit about the first mission to do exactly that. Here you see the spectacular liftoff of the Apollo 11 Saturn V in July of 1969. This would be our first historic mission to land on the moon. By this point in time, NASA designated each particular spacecraft with a shorthand name for communication purposes. And so it was that Apollo 11 command module was dubbed the Columbia, and the lunar module was called the Eagle. So after the launch, the translunar injection, and the burn into lunar orbit, you can see the 3 astronauts here at the top right, 2 of which moved into the lunar module to prepare for landing. Neil Armstrong on the left, Buzz Aldrin on the right. Remaining above in the service module, the command module, would be astronaut Michael Collins. So the world essentially held its breath as these astronauts prepared, again, for this very historic, very dramatic moment. When the lunar module first separated from the command module, Neil Armstrong, I think, made a very beautiful statement. He said, "The Eagle has wings." His spacecraft was ready, and they were ready to begin the descent. So, how about we ride along with them? How about we look out the window with the Apollo 11 astronauts for the last few minutes of their descent? You'll see that on the left, the actual footage. On the right will be improved footage taken based on images from NASA's recent Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that'll allow you a little better view. So let's listen in to that historic landing, those last few moments, as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are going to land on the moon.
Eagle, you're looking great. Coming up 9 minutes.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Altitude 5,200 feet. Manual attitude control is good.
Roger, copy.
Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201.
1201.
Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go. Same type. We're go.
2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees.
Roger.
47 degrees.
Eagle looking great. You're go.
Altitude 1,600. 1,400 feet, still looking very good.
Roger, 1202. We copy it.
35 degrees. 35 degrees. 750. Coming down to 23. 700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet down at 19. 540 feet down at 30. Down at 15. At 400 feet down at 9. Gate forward. 1050 feet down at 4. 33 and a half down. They're pegged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet down, 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. Down 1.5 down. 70. Got the shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 160 feet. 6.5 down. 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 20 feet. 100 feet. 3.5 down. 9 forward. 5%. How many bite? 75 feet. That's looking good. Down a half. 6 forward.
60 seconds.
Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Great shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. Down a half.
30 seconds.
Forward. Just. Good. Ready? Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You're looking good here.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
So that's how you land on the moon. And to this day, I can't help but smile every time I watch that. There was much going on there. Might not have looked all that hard. Number one, you heard some program alarms. As the astronauts are descending, the computer on board basically flashed what they call the 1201 or 1202 alarm, basically saying I'm overloaded, I'm too busy, I can't handle everything I'm being asked to do. And later they determined the reason. But here again, as I mentioned earlier, is where expertise came in. The flight controllers back in Houston monitoring all of this realized immediately that the 1201 and 1202 alarms were not serious enough to stop the landing. And so you heard the communicator say, well, you can continue your go on that. And that gave Armstrong and Aldrin not only the permission, but the confidence to move forward. You'll notice too, if you were to watch this in detail, that Armstrong had to do some very skillful piloting here, as the computer was going to land them right into a large crater. He knew he couldn't do that. He took manual control and flew forward on very limited fuel before reaching a safer place. So what a dramatic moment this was. The world was again holding its breath as word came down. This was a Sunday in July of 1969 when we first landed on the moon. Armstrong's famous words, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. So what a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment this was. Over 400,000 people contributed to this moment by working on the Apollo program. So many different industries, so much time, effort, and energy had gone into this moment for astronauts to be on the moon. By the way, you also heard a couple of call outs of 60 seconds of fuel remaining, and then at one point, 30 seconds of fuel remaining before the descent stage would exhaust its fuel and force them to abort. A lot of people were very, very nervous about that. Later, when Armstrong was asked, he simply said in his usual calm manner, I knew how much fuel I had. And he was the one that could see where he needed to land and did so beautifully. So here's one of the first pictures he took looking back at the lunar module, with the sun, of course, behind them. He took plenty of other pictures as well. You see one here of Edwin Aldrin descending the ladder, and then a picture of him on the lunar surface. So some hours after the landing, the astronauts were originally scheduled to have a rest period. Now I ask you, could you rest if you had just landed on the moon? I don't think so, and neither did the astronauts. So they asked permission to move up their moonwalk, the extravehicular activity, or EVA, and Mission Control gave them the approval for that on Sunday evening, 7 hours after landing. You might know that we have some footage of that as well. I'm going to show you one more clip here of a camera that was on the side of the lander and watched as the astronauts came down the ladder. This would be yet another historic moment, and you're probably familiar and have heard many times Armstrong's famous words there, this being a giant leap for mankind to stand on the moon. Of course, the astronauts were going to do some very important work here. They were going to deploy experiments, gather priceless lunar samples. They even left behind a laser reflecting device that once they were home, astronomers could fire pulses of laser light at to very precisely measure the distance to the moon and confirm for us that the moon was, in fact, slowly drifting away from Earth. So a lot of interesting things happening here. Perhaps the single biggest objective of this mission was, again, to land safely and prove that we could work on the moon. So it was a spectacular landing. Let's take one more video clip here and watch those first few steps on the moon, not only Armstrong, but Aldrin as well.
Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. And then a long one.
Aldrin now.
Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down to about the 4th rung up. There you go. Okay, now I think I'll do the same. For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this LAM. There's 2 hemispheres, one showing each of the 2 hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969, AT. He came in peace.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the...
So we wish we had more time to watch more of the moonwalks, but again, a very, very dramatic, historic event for us to walk on the moon for the first time. Well, the astronauts returned to their lander, and after a brief sleep period, did send back to lunar orbit to rendezvous with the command service modules and safely returned home to a very ecstatic, very jubilant nation and world. And I think it was summed up beautifully at the time when the President of the United States called the astronauts while they were on the moon. And he made a statement that I think was really good. He said, "For one priceless moment, all the people of Earth are one." And I think that was a beautiful sentiment, because when the United States landed there, they could have easily said, "We came here to conquer or to claim the moon." They didn't do that. Instead, we said that we came in peace for all mankind. I think a very noble sentiment, and the one that should drive all future exploration of the moon. Well, NASA was planning to continue on several more missions to the moon, and so it was by November of 1969, Apollo 12 was launched to return to the moon. It had a very inauspicious start. The booster was struck by lightning during launch, and essentially it knocked out the computer in the command module. Fortunately, the Saturn V booster had its own guidance and propelled itself into orbit. Once again, very quick thinking by a flight controller on Earth told the astronauts exactly what to do to restore the command module to proper operation. After a flight to the moon then, astronauts Pete Conrad and Al Bean landed, but they didn't just land anywhere. They wanted to try to land in a very specific spot, as you can see here, near an unmanned probe that had landed a few years earlier, to show that we could land in a very specific place, and they did exactly that. So this was a very successful mission as well. Probably the only problem was that the television camera on the moon was burned out when it was accidentally pointed at the moon. The next mission to head to the moon in April of 1970 was Apollo 13, and I'll bet that many of us know this story. A dramatic disaster struck Apollo 13 on its way to the moon. An oxygen tank aboard the service module exploded, crippling the spacecraft. As I described earlier, the service module would provide not only propulsion, but life support and power for the entire mission, and this was now gone. And so what was the option? Well, there was really only one left, and that was to move into and use the lunar module as what was called the lifeboat. Now, many of you have probably seen the movie Apollo 13. If you've not, I strongly urge you to do so. It's a beautiful example of the mission and what all took place. Very well done. Perhaps many of you remember the strong statement by the flight director, Gene Kranz, gathering his men in Houston at Mission Control. He made the statement that failure was not an option. We will find a way to bring these men home safely. We will not let them die in space. And that took a great deal of expertise and work to make happen, but they did that. They did extend the mission by using the lunar module as a lifeboat to loop around the moon and head back home, and then successfully land in the Pacific Ocean. And so the mission became known as a successful failure, which I think was a good way to put that, saving the lives of these men through the extraordinary work of Mission Control. Of course, NASA determined what was wrong and made sure that it could not possibly happen again. And so by February of 1971, Apollo 14 was ready to return to the moon and did so successfully, despite having a few problems of its own. there was trouble docking the lunar module with the command module on the way to the moon. Once that was resolved and they were in orbit, the lunar module was preparing to land, there was a faulty abort signal aboard the spacecraft that could have easily told the computer to abort the mission. Once that was resolved, the astronauts found while descending that their landing radar would not give them the proper altitude until it was almost too late. But they also managed to resolve that problem and land safely. At the controls of the lunar module was America's original first astronaut in space, Mercury veteran Alan Shepard, who returned to walk on the moon. And as I mentioned here, hit the first golf ball on the moon. For you golfers out there, word has it that it was a slice, but Shepard later claimed to have driven it for miles and miles. And it may just be true because of the weak lunar gravity. Well, NASA had even greater plans, and in returning in the summer of 1971 with Apollo 15, this was what was called a J mission with extended capabilities to stay on the surface for much longer, up to 3 days, and the ability for the astronauts to perform not 1 or 2, but 3 EVA trips out onto the surface. And so Dave Scott and Jim Orman did exactly that. You can see also they brought with them the first lunar rover or vehicle to drive around on the surface. It greatly extended their range, greatly extended their capability for them to do lunar science. By this point in time, scientists at home were in mission control, guiding the astronauts across the surface, looking for various formations and features, one of which you see in the lower right. This came to be known as the Genesis rock. Why that? Because it turned out to be one of the oldest sample rocks brought back from the moon, over 4 billion years old. So this was a treasure that they brought home and allowed scientists to examine the history of the moon farther back than ever before. So again, a very, very great mission in terms of not only its success, but the science that was now being done on the moon. The Apollo 15 mission was succeeded by Apollo 16, again, a very successful mission in April of 1972. John Young and Charlie Duke spending 71 hours, conducting 3 EVAs, collecting over 200 pounds of samples. And so again, I can safely say here that lunar science had really matured. The astronauts were highly trained now, and in working in conjunction with scientists at home, were doing great things on the surface of the moon. By this point in time, however, there was a bit of a gloom cast on the entire program because the remaining 3 missions of the series had been canceled. It was really considered a shame because, again, NASA had planned to fly all the way missions through Apollo 20, but Apollos 20, 19, and 18 were canceled. Why? Well, at the time, there was much going on in the United States. Some of you might know, unrest politically and socially. And some felt that we had been to the moon, we had accomplished our goal, and why should we continue to do that? And it was unfortunate because the rockets were built, the spacecraft were built, the astronauts were trained, and they simply canceled the missions. But there was one remaining mission to be flown, and that would be Apollo 17 in December of 1972. You see here a very dramatic night launch. This wasn't done just to impress people, it was done because the timing of the mission required that they launch then to reach the moon at a specific point in time and a specific place. So our final visit to the moon was commanded by Gene Cernan. Cernan was a native of Bellwood, Illinois, right here in the Chicago area. Some of you might know that the Cernan Space Center was named after him at Triton Community College. I invite you to go visit there. You can see some of the spacesuits and other memorabilia that Cernan used on his multiple missions into space. NASA also included an actual geologist on the mission, Jack Smith, and they completed our survey of the moon by doing, again, outstanding work, outstanding science. You see one dramatic view here of an astronaut in the rover near a very deep crater. When Cernan stepped off the surface of the moon, little did we know that it would be over 50 years before we would return, and yet it has been. And so, of course, many of us have waited a long time, and it begs the question, when will we return to the moon? So now that we've enjoyed our review of the Apollo program, I want to finish up with a few comments on, number one, what we learned. And I won't read this all to you, but those lunar samples I called priceless, and not only because of the tremendous effort to retrieve them, but because of what we learned from them. Essentially, I'll boil it down to two main types of rocks: common basalts or solidified lava, 3.6 to 3.9 billion years old, essentially showing there was widespread volcanism on the moon early in its history. I know many of you are very accomplished amateur astronomers, and you know that when you look up at the moon and see those dark regions, this is what we're describing. But the other main type, called a breccia, is really a composite of fragments of older rock. Generally, what happens here is high energy meteorite impacts break rocks into smaller pieces and fuse them together by heat and pressure, essentially kind of welding them or melting them together. So not only do these contain some basalts, but also other material from the lunar highlands, much older, more than 4 billion years of age. You see an example of that in the lower right here. So it's safe to say that the Apollo samples dramatically changed our understanding of the moon's formation and history. You may have heard that due to our analysis of these samples, we now feel that the moon was formed not originally with the Earth, but due to an enormous collision of another large body with Earth, and that material then formed our moon in orbit around us. So again, these lunar samples did prove to be priceless in more ways than one. So what was it all about? With the hindsight of 50 years, we can look back. There's been much written, much discussed, and we've already talked about the unprecedented commitment, time, energy, effort, planning, resources, and technology that had to be invented. And yet my first point here is that we did it. The United States did it in a free economy, on display to the entire world, and it was a matter of national pride that we were able to accomplish this. Well, I want to make one other point here, and that is that in the last few years, there's been somewhat of a lessening or weakening of the public's respect for science and things it can accomplish. And I want to, I guess, emphasize that Apollo reminds us of what science can do for us. Now, of course, science itself can't do anything. It requires human beings to utilize it as a tool. But when we properly use science, look at the amazing things we can do. We can send astronauts to the moon safely and return them, as Kennedy challenged us. So I think it is no exaggeration. I think it is safe to say that Apollo has been our greatest adventure up till now. But again, many have waited many years, perhaps you among them, to see us return. Well, the good news is, it looks like it's finally going to happen. So let me conclude then with a few comments on the next chapter. You might know that NASA has been directed to return to the moon and to endeavor to land by 2024, which is not all that far away. So the question is, will this play out? Will we successfully do that? It appears that all the pieces are coming together. Although there were a few false starts years ago, NASA has now established a new moon landing program called Artemis, Artemis being the twin sister of Apollo in ancient mythology. You see 4 major components. I'll touch on them briefly. At the left, a new large booster. The lower left, a new command spacecraft, the Orion. We also, for the first time, are envisioning a lunar gateway, which will be in orbit around the moon. And of course, finally, we will require a lander. So let me just, again, touch on each of these just briefly. The Space Launch System is NASA's new large booster. After many, many years of flying the space shuttle, NASA realized they had high quality, high performance, and well-proven engines. They did not need to reinvent the wheel. They did not need to go back and start all over. They said simply, let's use the engines that we used for the space shuttle so successfully, including those solid rocket boosters. Now, the problem is Space Launch System has been behind schedule and over budget, but its first flight is rapidly approaching. The Orion spacecraft has been in development for a number of years. This is a larger, more modern, more updated version of the Apollo command module. It will have room for 4 astronauts to travel to the moon, and again, provide all the command and control, life support, communications for the mission. You see on the left, the command module and a smaller service module still attached to what is called an interim upper stage to the Space Launch System. This would be the stage that would boost them towards the moon, much as the Apollo Saturn V third stage did for Apollo. NASA also here took the opportunity to extend an opportunity for the European Space Agency to contribute to this program, I think wisely, to provide, again, propulsion, attitude control, power for the mission. And this has included, again, a great contribution by ESA on the service module. What is the gateway? Well, NASA envisions a very small lunar outpost in orbit around the moon in a very eccentric orbit, ranging from 1,000 up to 40,000 miles above the moon. Why would they do this? Well, many of you know that the farther away you are from orbiting a planet, the slower you travel. And as a result, when Orion heads to the moon, it would be able to dock and rendezvous with Gateway at the high point where it's moving slower. This will minimize the amount of fuel that the Orion spacecraft would need to get into lunar orbit. So that's a useful way to do that. You can see there's plans for it to be a lab for research, a depot for supplies and fuel, even a communication relay. And they've envisioned it as a platform that could be used in the future as well for missions even farther than the moon. How about the lander? NASA had started on a lander years ago, which was canceled, and so has now instead turned to offering 3 commercial companies the opportunity to build the lander. You can see here the Dynetics Human Landing System on the left, the SpaceX Starship in the center, and the Blue Origin Integrated Landing Vehicle on the right. Each a different approach, each has merit to it, and so right now these designs are being evaluated, and at some point NASA will select one or more to be the lander to work along with Orion to take astronauts back to the moon. So it seems that at long last, the journey is continuing. We are on our way back to the moon. The next few years hold great promise. What are the immediate next steps? Well, the first 3 Artemis missions have been spelled out. The Artemis 1 mission will be an uncrewed flight of SLS and Orion, currently scheduled for November of 2021. Orion would be sent to the moon on a 3-week mission, perhaps spending 6 days in orbit before returning home. And this would greatly increase our confidence in the booster and in the spacecraft. Artemis 2 is currently scheduled to be the first crewed mission sometime in 2023, after reaching a very high Earth orbit to test a rendezvous. Then the spacecraft would perform a translunar injection and head to the moon. Now, the current flight plan calls for them to swing around the moon on what's known as a free return trajectory, not going into orbit. In case there was any problems, the spacecraft would loop around the moon once and return home safely. It's deemed that this will be a sufficient challenge for that first crewed mission. And then the Artemis 3 mission, currently scheduled to actually land on the moon in 2024. I will say that this is a very challenging date for NASA to meet. There's much that must be done, not only with SLS and Orion, but again, simply building that lander and testing it before you can entrust it to carry humans to the lunar surface. So again, exciting times are ahead. In the next few years, we hope to finally see Americans heading back to the moon. Would you like to see one last video clip of what an Artemis mission will look like? Let me share that with you now, and you get a little taste of what we anticipate. So I'll pause our video there. I think that gives you a nice taste of what we expect to see again in the next few years as the Artemis missions begin. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for having me tonight to discuss with you again our greatest adventure, Apollo reaches the moon. Before I entertain any questions, I'll just remind you that if you'd like to view any of my other videos, you can go out to YouTube and just type my name in, and you'll find quite a few other presentations I've done at the College of DuPage. And if you'd like, you can also view my 2 short astronomy courses, video courses out on YouTube, one on the solar system and one on stars and galaxies. So again, thank you very much for having me tonight. At this time, I'd be glad to turn it back and take any questions that you might have.
So we only had one question, Joe, and it was from Randall, and he asked why the lower section of the lunar module was covered in gold foil and not the upper section.
That's a good question. To my knowledge, that has to do with the thermal protection for the different stages. You want to remember that, of course, in that descent stage, you've got some very reactive fuel, and you want to maintain a certain temperature there. That was one of many, many challenges, of course, whereby they had to come up with a solution that was extremely lightweight, relatively inexpensive, and be able to implement that fairly easily on that lunar module. And so that was the solution they came up with, was that gold foil. So the lunar module itself, we could talk for hours about its design and development. It was quite a challenge, but was obviously played out.
Okay, we don't have questions.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much for having me tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you again very much, Joe. I hope that tonight's programming has helped bring everybody a little bit wider perspective. It's always good to look up and think about the big picture of space and all. As far as closing out tonight, again, thank you all for attending. We'd be happy to hear your thoughts. So if you want to send us an email or continue on putting things in our Facebook comment section for tonight's program, we'd most welcome your input on even ideas for things you'd like to see us stream in the future. This presentation will remain on our Facebook page and embedded on our club website, so you can refer other people to it still to see it in the future. And as a last note, as I know was listed in our newsletter and a note was sent to the members today, we're going to try having a virtual after party on Zoom. So the members should have the information on how to join that. And we'll start that within a few minutes of finishing this program. So for tonight, I'd like to say goodnight to you all, and I hope you can join us again for some of our future streaming events and eventually back out under the stars. Thanks much and good night.